This lecture is around the subject of the Passover. What I wanted to do is, again, give a sidelight to our considerations in Leviticus and maybe lead us in a discussion of some of the features of sacrifice that lead into what's in Leviticus. And the best way to do that is just to look at some of the features around the Passover. Now, I'd like to start in Exodus chapter 11 before we go into chapter 12 and just look at the details here. We'll start in verse 4 of Exodus 11. I'm assuming you remember the general gist of the Passover and what's going on there. Everybody's seen the movie, so we have some idea about it, even if you don't remember where it is in the Bible. Exodus 11:4, Moses said, "Thus says Yahweh, about midnight I am going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well." Now, what's noticeable there, what's important, is that the cattle are included in the firstborn. See, who are the firstborn of Israel? Who are the firstborn? Well, it's not just human beings, it's also the firstborn of animals. We read on, verse 6, "Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and such as will never be again. But against any of the sons of Israel a dog shall not even sharpen his tongue." Now that's what that says. Your Bible probably says a dog shall not bark. But it doesn't say bark, it means lick his chops. And literally it means sharpen his tongue. And a dog sharpens his tongue as he gets ready to eat. And the idea here is that the dogs will eat the dead bodies. And that's part of the curse of the covenant, to have your carcass left out unburied and be eaten up by the birds and the dogs. And so what is being said here is that none of the sons of Israel will come under this curse. The dog will not sharpen his tongue to eat. Now let me read the verse again, having gotten that corrected translation. "Against any of the sons of Israel a dog shall not even sharpen his tongue, whether against man or beast." Now do you notice what's said there? The sons of Israel includes men and beasts. Notice that? It's real clear in Hebrew. The sons of Israel, man or beast, will not be subject to being eaten up by the dogs. And that you may understand how Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Now, a couple of things that are important there and that feed into the sacrificial system, and of course Peter mentioned this in his first lecture, is that all the sacrifices are sons. And they're all, in a sense, firstborn sons. Because you see, what's going to happen is, in order to spare the firstborn son, we're going to take a lamb and shed its blood as a substitute. But the lamb that is taken and killed is a son. It's a son of the house, by definition. We think of sons and daughters as those that come out of the loins of our wives, or if you're a woman, out of yours, you see. And we tend to view adopted children as in a somewhat different category, but in the Bible they're not. Sons is a broader concept. Sons includes the animals here. Firstborn includes the animals here. So when you select a lamb, you're putting a son to death. And every time you bring an animal for sacrifice in the Old Testament, you're bringing your son and sacrificing your son. So now what do we do with that? Well, we can, of course, jump forward to Jesus and say this points to the only begotten Son of God and His death. But let's not do that. Let's read it in context. If you're an Israelite and you're alive in Moses' day, and this is the language that's being used, what do you think back to? Isaac. Isaac is the son. Isaac is the seed who is promised. The seed of the woman, there's the son. There's going to have to be a second Adam. The second Adam will be the seed of the woman. So he's a son. And Isaac, at that stage in history, at that point in history, Isaac is the seed. He is the son of the woman, the seed of the woman. The woman's womb is closed, it's opened up. He's the miracle child. And he is the one who's going to be sacrificed, and then an animal is put in his place. The animal is the son. And so it's important, I think, to remember that in the book of Leviticus, we're not just bringing animals. We're bringing animals that are domestic or somehow domestic to the house. Now, that raises a question, you see, about pigeons and turtle doves. Were those domestic? And my thinking has been that, well, they probably weren't. You probably had to catch them. But we would say they were domestic to God's house. But Peter pointed out to me, the Milgram says that those birds were relatively domesticated. And so of the animals that God selects to be sacrificial animals, all 5 of them are connected with the house and can be seen as sons, representing the house. So I think that's an aspect of the sacrifices that we need to bring to play. That was always pointing to human sacrifice and always pointing to the sacrifice of your son. And the death of your son then becomes the foundation for building your civilization. The blood of your son is put at the base of the altar. We read over in Kings that when the city of Jericho was refounded, Hiel built it on the death of his firstborn son. When the city was finished, his last son died. We don't know if Hiel sacrificed his firstborn son as a foundation sacrifice, but we know that in the pagan religions of the ancient world that was very common. Threshold sacrifice. You kill an animal, bury it at the threshold, and then you build your house on it, and that cleansed the space from demonic influences. And if it was really important, maybe you killed your son in order to build your house on it. The king of Moab executed his son in order to get victory in battle, as we read in the Bible. And so the idea of killing a son, a firstborn son, and then building civilization on top of it is there in the Bible, and it's part of what's pictured in the sacrificial system. So it's not just animals, it's sons. And it's the firstborn son. His death then atones and also becomes the foundation for building an altar, building a mountain that takes over the world. Remember that the altar had to be made of unhewn stones. You will not put your tool on it. So when Daniel chapter 2 says that he saw a stone cut without human hands, that's a reference to the altar. The altar is a miniature holy mountain. He says he sees that stone cut without hands grow to fill the earth. He's seeing the miniature model of the holy mountain grow until it becomes the mountain that the New Jerusalem is on in Revelation, a mountain that's the size of the world. It means that worship, the altar, is the place where all of this starts. We shouldn't think, I don't believe in Daniel 2 of some rock rolling down a hill. I think we need to think of the altar. The establishment of true worship is that which knocks down the statue of the world humanist powers. And if you go into Zechariah chapter 1, we see that the 4 horns that destroyed Jerusalem are the 4 horns of the counterfeit worship, the apostasy, and then the carpenters come to rebuild the altar. And when the altar is rebuilt in Zechariah chapter 1, then by Zechariah 6, the horses are going out to conquer the world. But all of that building of the altar is built on the blood of the Son. And that's what we have here. Similarly, at the Passover, the doorway of the house is going to be covered with this blood. So that's one thing that stands out here, and as Peter pointed out, the expression son of the herd that's used in Leviticus 1 is not the same as the word for a young bull. That is another word, and the expression son of the herd again points to this idea of sonship. Any questions or observations on that point before we move to the next aspect of the Passover? I might remind you of how the altar was made, the bronze altar. It was a shell, 4-sided shell of bronze, open at the top and the bottom. And you would set it on the ground, and then you would put the rocks into it. So the stones that are not to be cut by hands are put inside of this shell. And then there was a grating over it, and the fire was put into it. But when you read about the blood being dashed against the sides, it's talking about those bronze sides, but then there are rocks inside of it. So it's a stone altar, but it's surrounded by this bronze shield. And the bronze shield is the skin of the altar, which represents the man. Man is made of dirt, so the stones represent man.
Families that still keep some
No. In Passover, the animal comes from God's household, and only by extension, individual households. We'll see that right away here. Now it says, against any of the sons of Israel, a dog shall not sharpen his tongue, whether man or beast. Now at Passover, they killed all these lambs. Did any of the leftovers of the Passover go to the dogs? No. They ate it all, or anything that was left was burned up in fire, you see. So the dog, the curse of the covenant, goes to absolutely none of it. All of it is consumed. All of it is given to God and to God's people. The dogs get none of it. You see how that phrase fits in. On the other hand, the dogs eat up Jezebel, and the dogs eat up Ahab, and the birds come and eat up all the dead bodies in Revelation chapter 19. The anti-feast, the anti-marriage supper of the Lamb. While we're at the marriage supper of the Lamb, the birds are all out eating the corpses of the enemies. Kind of an all-or-nothing proposition here. Chapter 12. We'll look at the chronology of this in a minute because I think it would be interesting to you. Just read on for the moment. Now, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, in the land of Egypt. This takes place in Egypt, and I think that the reason that information is included is that the rules of Passover that are given right here applied only that first time. We know that they ate with their sandals on their feet and standing up and getting ready to leave and so forth. That's not the way Passover was done later on. We know that they slaughtered the lamb at their own house and put blood on the doorpost. Well, they never did that again. As soon as the tabernacle was set up, the Passover lambs were brought to the tabernacle and slaughtered there. And later on in the temple, they were brought there. And we see that when the Passover is described later on in the Bible. And blood wasn't put on the doorpost anymore because blood was put on the altar, which becomes the doorpost more or less for the entire nation. But here, this first time is different. It's in the land of Egypt, and so that phrase is included. He says, this month will be the beginning of months for you. It will be the first month of the year. Now, do you know how months are done in the ancient world? Our months are arbitrary. We have a solar calendar where we measure the year by the sun. And the year begins, arbitrarily, January the 1st, which has not a date that's really relevant to the solar calendar. But our years are adjusted in such a way that the vernal equinox is always going to come at the same time. And the winter solstice is always going to come around December 21st. And adjustments are made in the calendar to account for that. Every fourth year is a leap year, except on century years. And a century year, the year 1900, 1800, is not a leap year, unless it's every 400 years. The year 1600 and the year 2000 are leap years. So if you thought you were going to get to skip a leap year in the year 2000, no, it'll be a leap year same as any other fourth year. But the year 2100 won't be a leap year. And we have these things to keep us on the solar calendar. But the moon doesn't function that way. The moon goes around the earth every 28 point something or other days. And a lunar month is that long. Our months are arbitrary so that they fit the solar calendar with different lengths of days. But the moons were set up in the Old Testament by sighting. You sighted the new moon. The new moon is when the moon is, you first see that first sliver showing up from the dark of the moon. And that's the beginning of the month. And what you have to do every third year is have an extra month stuck in, because a lunar year is only 354 days. So you're losing 11 days off the solar year every year. So every third year you've got to have an extra month in there to keep you back on. Otherwise, your Passover is going to be receding until it's in the middle of winter, and then it's going to be in the fall, and so forth. Well, they would cite these months, and this is the beginning of months. The calendar dates from then. In the Old Testament, the month is the primary way to date. It's lunar time. Now, there are two different ways to do the year. The religious year in the Old Testament begins as the sun rises in the morning. So it begins in the spring. And some days begin to get longer. And the sun rises in terms of the year. The civil year begins in the evening and morning. And so it begins in the fall. The first of the civil months is the seventh of the religious months. And we see this in Leviticus 25, 9, and 10. That goes back to the creation days, evening and morning. And in the annual sense, evening and morning, you begin in the fall and go around to the fall again. It seems to me that the lunar imagery of the Old Testament gives way to solar imagery, because the imagery of Christ is that of the Son of righteousness rising with healing in his wings. And so you don't see anything in the New Testament about months anymore. Whatever imagery there is more solar, although we're not bound to any type of externally regulated calendar in the New Covenant. So this is the beginning of months. The Passover starts the calendar. It starts a new creation. This month does. Verse 3 says, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb or a kid." This is a flock member, whether it's a sheep or a goat, "for themselves, according to their fathers' households, a flock member for each household." Now, if the household is too small for a flock member, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the flock member. Now, what's interesting about that is it doesn't say get together with your next of kin. It says get together with your next door neighbor. Now, if you were an Israelite or a Jew in the ancient world, they would have been Israelites or Hebrews at this point in time, actually, that wouldn't be your instinct, you see. You think, well, I'll get together with my nearest family members and do this. And you need to sit together as families in church and do everything as families, because the family is the foundation of civilization. But that's not what it says. The natural family drops away, and what comes into focus here is the spiritual family of the Israelite church. Whoever is nearest to you, that's your family when it comes to worship. And so the command is to go to the house nearest and just join up with them. And that's why I say it's not just each house has to have its own representative house for house. There is that idea of house for house, but it's subsumed under the idea that there's one large house here, which is the house of Israel. And I think that's why you can move from the Passover, where each house has its own lamb, or there are lots of different lambs and lots of different houses, some of which are combined. You can move from that to having one house and one doorpost in the house, which is the altar, and one lamb for the entire nation. Because what we're really looking at here is one house. One house with many rooms, but more than one family in some of the rooms, so to speak. You follow that? We're going to move from this, you see, to the tabernacle, being the house for Israel. And the doorway to the tabernacle is where the animal is slaughtered. So his blood comes out there. And then it's put on the altar, which is the mountain, and the mountain is the doorway into heaven. It's the ladder that reaches up. So there's a correspondence here, you see. The Passover, you're in a house, you've got a doorway that leads into the house, you kill an animal there, you put the blood on that doorway. You go into the tabernacle, that whole structure is a house. Leviticus 1 says you slaughter the animal in the doorway of the tabernacle. But the doorway is that entire court. Because the tabernacle is halfway back, remember? It's halfway back in the court, and in the front of the court is the altar. And the doorway of the tabernacle is this entire front court area where the altar is. So slaying it in the doorway of the tabernacle means slaying it near the altar. And putting it on the doorposts is equivalent to putting it on the altar. And so there's one house for the entire nation. And once that house is set up, then these individual homes for Passover are not only unnecessary, but wrong. You are forbidden to slaughter sacrifices anywhere except the tabernacle. So the idea that this is a family feast, or that it's family by family, is not correct. It is an ecclesiastical feast, which, because the tabernacle had not been built, it's broken up conveniently into individual households. But once the tabernacle is set up, then it all goes there. Now, of course, when the tabernacle was dismantled in 1 Samuel and was down for 100 years before the temple was set up, then you go back to having many places of worship. They worship in high places. And I suppose that Passover might have been done in individual homes. You remember the time that Saul wanted to kill David, and David had fled, so Jonathan could see just how much Saul hated David. And Saul says to Jonathan, "Where's David?" And David says, "Well, he's celebrating a feast with his family." So they were not following that rule of everything, all the feasts having to be done at the sanctuary, because during those years there was no central sanctuary in Israel. The ark was located at the house of Abinadab on the hill, and the rest of the tabernacle was, where was it? Shiloh, wasn't it? Isn't that where Solomon went? Solomon went to where the tabernacle was, but the ark had been brought up to Jerusalem. They were in two different places until the temple was built and everything was put back together again. And during those years, there were many places of worship. But that one and the many is not two different things. The many places of worship, the many doorposts here, all point to the one. And I think we see that in the fact that you don't get together with your kinfolk to do the Passover. You get together with your next door neighbor. Because the boundary lines of this family are the entire nation. Is that clear? I think that speaks to the way a lot of Reformed and Reconstructionist type people begin to think that the church, that somehow or other we have to magnify the nuclear or domestic family in the church. Communion elements should be served to fathers and they should give it to their families. Everything should be done family by family. I don't think that's correct. I think that in the church, the elders represent the husband and the father of the household, and they should give it to each member, if possible. Or if you pass it down the aisle, each member should take it himself. Because when you come into church, those natural family lines are dissolved, and what counts is the spiritual family. And the representative of the father and the husband is the elder who distributes the elements. And I think we see here, and by implication other places, that the natural family is not in focus.
Is that very in relation to the fact that when we ascend to heaven, the family ties are broken as far as the family, sitting all as one family forever?
Yes. In worship in the ascension, there's neither marriage nor giving in marriage, you see. And I think there's more to it than this. You see, sin breaks the covenant relations between husband and wife, parent and child. And in worship, the breaking up of everything in worship is a confession of that. And we'll talk about this in a minute. The coming of the Shekinah glory knits everything back together again so that when you leave church, all these other relationships have been restored and healed. That used to be more dramatic in the early church and even in Puritan times when men would sit on one side of the church and women on the other. You would separate when you came into church and you would rejoin when you went back out. Not that I think that that's important or that we should do that or that we shouldn't sit by families or anything. But, the reflection here is that what counts in worship is not the natural family. Let's see, that was verse 4. The households are ecclesiastical rather than biological in this passage. Now, just for your information and fun, you might take a look at this chronology of the Passover. Where we are right now in chapter 12 of Exodus is in the first day of Nisan, which is the new moon. And on that day, the Lord speaks to Moses and Aaron. And on that day, as we'll see, Moses tells the elders what the Lord has said several days before. The next days are the days of the plague of locusts. On the 10th of the month, the Passover lambs are set aside, which is going to be the third day of the second week. As the third day theme comes in there. And then immediately after that comes the plague of darkness. I don't know if you'd ever thought about that or noticed it before, but you see, the plague of darkness comes between the setting aside of the lambs and their sacrifice. In Moses' last interview with Pharaoh, which has already happened in Exodus, has already been recorded, happens after that. And then Passover comes in the evening, and then the Exodus from Egypt comes at the beginning of the third week. These notes actually came from studies in Exodus that I've been doing week by week, but it's easy for me to bring them in and let you see the whole package here. You've got parallels to the first month of the civil year, and that the atonement is on the 10th day. That's the day you set aside the lamb in the first month. The Tabernacles begins on the 15th day. But there's a contrast in that only Israel is present at the Passover. You must be circumcised to participate in Passover. A converted Gentile is not welcome at Passover because he's not part of the nation of priests. So Jethro doesn't participate in Passover because he's not circumcised. Moses didn't circumcise his sons when he was living in Jethro's household. They were uncircumcised Gentile believers. Numbers 15 gives you all the rules about what happens if an uncircumcised Gentile believer wants to draw near and worship. And he's free to do so, on the same par with an Israelite, except when it comes to Passover. He's not part of the nation of priests. But now, when you get to the 7th month, this eschatological month, the Feast of Tabernacles, the nations are invited to participate. So I think that shows the theme of the gospel going to the Jew first and then to the world, the priestly relationship of Israel to the rest of the world. And there are other things we could notice. The third day theme here, and the wedding feast at Cana, when it happens on the third day. Some other references there you can pick up on later on. Well, let's read further. Chapter 12, verse 5 says, "Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, or your flock member, a year old. You can take it from the sheep or from the goats." The animal has to be grown, but it has to be young. It's cut off in its youth. Remember that the lamb is a son of the house. It dies in its youth. Now again, we can jump forward to Jesus and say Jesus didn't live to be 50 or 60. He was in his youth. The Bible certainly considers 33 to be youthful. Rehoboam was in his 40s. And the Bible speaks of Rehoboam and all the young men who grew up with him, who were the youth and who didn't listen to the elders. So Jesus is cut off in his youth, and that would follow the same idea here. But what do you think back to? Remember, we want to interpret in context. Where would you see a reference to cutting off in the youth? I see lips move, but I hear no sounds. Anybody have a thought? It's Genesis 8:21. Genesis 8:21, "After the flood, Yahweh smelled the soothing aroma of the sacrifices. And Yahweh said to himself," this is important, he didn't say this to anybody else, this is an internal pledge on God's part to himself, "I will never again abuse the ground on account of man." Your Bible may say curse the ground, but it's not the same word as the curse on the soil earlier, so we want to try to keep words like this distinct because they're so important. "I will never again abuse or injure the ground on account of man, because the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done." Now, the intent of man's heart had been evil from his youth before the flood, but now God says after the flood, "I will not destroy the earth again because his intent of his heart is evil from his youth." How does that happen? Well, the way it happens is when Ham, the youngest son, commits a sin, he's immediately judged. Instead of allowing the Hamites and the Canaanites to grow until they destroy the earth like before the flood, what God does is he intervenes in the youth of man's sin to cut it off. So he cuts off the sin of Ham and puts a judgment on Ham through Noah, and he brings a judgment against the descendants of Ham, so that the wickedness of man is never allowed to progress beyond a certain point. It's not allowed to progress beyond the third day. It's cut off. It's cut off in the youth. And here again, you'll see the sacrifices are young animals. You sacrifice a young bull. You sacrifice here a 1-year-old lamb. Almost without exception, they are young animals. And if we were to, again, compare links in the chain, we might find a few instances where it's a 3-year-old animal. But even there, that's fairly young. And the 3-year-old, third day, third month, third year, third hour theme is coming through there. Here it's quite young, a year old. The youngness of the bull is important because if you use a male bull to represent a sinless and peaceful human being, a lamb, like a lamb, you can't let that bull get to be more than about 15 or 16 months old, or it becomes ornery. Young bulls are nice, but then when they go through puberty, they become ornery. So I think that's also involved in using the young bull because of its docility. The older bull is likely to rise up and gore a man, and then that bull will have to be stoned and put to death. So the young bull is what you use. But here I think the idea is cutting off of the sin of man in the youthfulness of history. I think that when Christ does finally return, we will look back and from that date be able to see that the redemptive work of Christ happened very early in the history of the human race. And I think that Warfield was right when he said we are still in the infancy of the church. The cutting off of sin happens in the youth. That's how I allegorize that verse. Then verse 6. "It shall be to you for a guarding," literally. You will guard it. You guard this lamb through the days of darkness until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation is to kill it between the evenings. Now that's the transition to the 15th day. The 15th day is like the 8th day. It is the beginning of the third week. It's the beginning of a new week. And I didn't do this, but you can do it. You can really look at this schedule of events here and see The first week goes by, and the second week goes by, and the 8th day starts the second week, and the 15th day starts the third week. This whole third week is a week where there will be no unleavened bread. It's a week in which you cut off everything that's in the past and start again. So as you transition into the 15th day, this blood is set up as a marker that takes away the sin of the first 2 weeks and creates the possibility of a new week, a new stage in history. It says the entire assembly is to kill it at the same time. And you see, that emphasizes this ecclesiastical unity that's there. Then we come to the parts that we might want to spend a little bit more time on, as if we haven't spent enough time already. Verses 7 following. You will take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts and on the lintel of your houses in which they eat it. The lintel of the houses in which they eat it. So you see, not every house is going to have it, right? You got 3 or 4 families that are just small, young married couples living in a row. They all get together, and the house where they eat it, the house where they sacrifice it, that's where this blood's going to go up. You don't need to have it on every house. They're grouped in house churches. And it's put on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel, which is across the top. Some have speculated that you would also get it on the threshold as a result, but I'm not sure that there's enough evidence to argue that. Verse 8 says, they shall eat the flesh that same night, roast it with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Don't eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roast it with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. Don't leave any of it until morning. Whatever is left until morning, you'll burn with fire. Let's go back to verse 7 and this application of blood. Blood displayed makes a place a sanctuary for...
Can you consider some argument that their household is sacred ground?
Yes. It becomes sacred ground at this point. There are a lot of things it becomes. It becomes a womb, so that when they come out of it, it's like a new birth. There's a real overlay of many kinds of imagery here. But this display of blood is there for God to see. Because, you see, all the Israelites are going to be inside their houses. This is like the memorial. You're going to be inside. You're not going to be out there looking at it. God is the one who has to see it. And the same thing's true in the tabernacle and the altar. The blood displayed on the altars makes these places a sanctuary where God dwells. It turns away the wrath of God and enables God to come in the fire. The blood is put on the altar. God comes in the fire and is able to be there because sin is taken away. And if we go back to Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 to 26, we find circumcision has the same meaning. What happened in Moses' circumcision of his firstborn son was Zipporah took the blood and smeared it on his legs, and the angel of death who was trying to kill Gershom departed because the blood was displayed there. And she makes the comment to her son, you are a bridegroom of blood for me. Now, what does that mean? Without going into all the details, Moses is her husband. And Moses, like Adam, is supposed to be a sanctuary or a protector or a priest for Zipporah. She says to her son, you are now, in a sense, my husband, a bridegroom. You, my son, are my protector. You, my son, are my priest. You, my son, are my sanctuary. Because the blood displayed on the legs of the firstborn makes him a sanctuary, and a sanctuary for the bride. Now remember, we're still in this sonship theme. You kill an animal that's a son, you display his blood, that creates a sanctuary where the bride can be. They're parallel ideas. In Joshua 5, verse 3, we have an interesting statement. They didn't circumcise themselves in the wilderness because they were not acting as a nation of priests. They were not carrying out God's judgments and entering the promised land and guarding God's ways, so they didn't circumcise. And there may be more reasons than that. But when they got to the promised land, God really tested them, had them camp right underneath Jericho and then circumcise themselves, which would have really incapacitated them for 2 or 3 days if the Jerichoites had decided to come out and make trouble, but the Jerichoites didn't. And they trusted God enough to do this. Verse 2 of Joshua 5, At that time Yahweh said to Joshua, make for yourselves flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel a second time. Now this has to mean the nation is circumcised again, not individuals. Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of foreskins. So they piled them all up and made a hill right there by the Jordan River, again a doorway marker. And this makes the land into a sanctuary. God can go now into the land. This is the Shekinah glory can come into the tabernacle after the blood is put all over it. If we were to look at the ritual of consecrating the tabernacle, we would see that the blood is put all over it. Then God comes into it. Just as God stays on the altar in the form of fire because blood keeps being put on it, just as Moses' son can become the priest and the sanctuary for the bride, for Israel, so God can enter the Holy Land, make it a sanctuary, because blood is spilled there. The wrath of God is turned away, and so God enters back in. Now, what happens if the blood isn't there? What will God do? What if God is offended? What will He do? If the true, faithful shedding of blood stops, and God is no longer pleased to turn away His wrath. And what does that mean? First of all, it means His wrath will come, but what else does it mean? The place will no longer be a sanctuary, and God will depart. And that's the threat. It happens right away at the incident of the golden calf. God packs up and moves out. It says Moses took the tent outside the camp. And the people would come out to their tents and look, and they would see off in the distance the cloud would come down and talk to Moses, way over there. Because the abomination that causes desolation had happened, and God had desolated the camp. And Moses has to persuade God to come back in. So there's this double action that takes place. The angel of death aggressively killing the firstborn because the blood is not there, and also God deserting the people because the blood isn't there. The blood makes a sanctuary, and this is true of all the sacrifices. The Passover starts it out, and all the sacrifices then break it up to show applications of it. Leviticus 1, you display blood on the altar, then you put the animal on it. That's what I've got written down here. Yes. Notice how it says, verse 5 of Leviticus 1. He slays the son of the herd in front of Yahweh. Kill your son in front of Yahweh. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer up the blood and dash it around the altar. That's at the doorway. Doorposts and lintels. Doorway. This is the doorway into the tabernacle. You want to get in the tabernacle? You got to put that blood on the doorway, which is the altar. Then he will skin the burnt offering and cut it in pieces. And then look at verse 7. The sons of Aaron shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Well, of course they've got fire on the altar. Of course they've got to put wood on the altar. Why are we told it? Why does it happen at this step in the rite? Because that's when the Shekinah comes to be with the people after the blood is there. The blood enables us to go in. It enables God to come down. The blood enables these two things to take place. Let me take Peter's question first.
Just a couple questions about the shedding of blood.
Right. It's the presence of God in glory that makes the place a sanctuary, and my language has been too condensed. In other words, the blood makes it possible for God to come and consecrate the place a sanctuary by His presence.
It makes a pathway for God as well as for us.
Yes. It makes a pathway for God as well as for the worshiper. That's right. And go ahead, though.
What was Peter's question regarding the blood of the tabernacle?
Was blood sprinkled around the tabernacle and before God came into it? I think Hebrews says that that's the case. Yeah. And I forget where you go in the Old Testament to see that, or if it's just by implication.
My point was just, I didn't see it.
I don't think it is in Exodus 40. I think you have to put Leviticus 8 and 9 together with it, and then you get all the details. Now, if all that's true, then you see we can go back to the first Passover and these people inside these homes and see that God's Shekinah glory comes to be with them. The blood opens this doorway, and God comes to be with His people. And that being the case, then I think you can associate that with Pentecost and being together in a room and the Shekinah coming to be with the people there as well. Where I wanted to go with this was simply to say this unpacks some of the meaning of the entire sacrificial system. See, what's going on in the sacrifices? Well, it makes a way for God to come and remain in the sanctuary. It makes a way of access for us. It turns away the angel of death. The open display of blood does these things. And you had a question or comment?
Apparently, my thinking that the whole...
It's not just keeping the wrath of God away in propitiation, you see. It's also this glorification idea. And an incorporation into a new community and body.
That really is a fellowship meal.
Yeah.
I haven't gone that far.
Yeah. By implication, I think God is there at the Passover with them.
One thing that might help to confirm that, I think this is winnowing.
That's part of the mystery of the Godhead. Well, now we come to the next aspect of this Passover, verses 8 and 9. This says, "They shall eat the flesh the same night, roasted with fire. They will eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Don't eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roast it with fire, both its head and its legs along with its entrails. You will not leave any of it over until morning. Whatever is left until morning you will burn with fire." Well, I think that roasting it over the fire rather than boiling it points to the sacrificial aspect of this. It's not just cooked. It's a sacrifice. The fire represents God's presence, and God is the one who prepares the food. Also, there's nothing added to it. No water or anything else gets into it. It is entirely the sacrificial animal. It's not broken up before cooking, and that is unlike all the other sacrifices. All the other sacrifices display the curse of covenant by being cut up or rent in half. Because the curse of the covenant is to be torn in half. A man grabs his garments and says, "May I be ripped in half. May the Lord do so to me and more." You tear your clothes and you say, "May the Lord do so to me and more. May the Lord tear my clothes and more. Tear me if I don't do such and such." So that tearing in half represents the curse of the covenant. Then the birds come down, or the animals come to eat what's there. Well, all the other sacrifices show that. The mincha is broken up. In every case, the tribute offering, it says the priest takes a memorial portion. So that means that's broken off from the rest of it. If you have a bunch of flour here, you put the oil on it so it's saturated in oil, and you put the incense in the pile in the middle, the priest takes that part, so he separates it. In the case of the birds, the head is taken off. It's always cut up, and it always displays the curse of the covenant this way. Passover is different in that regard. And now why that's so is a good question. And I think it's that Passover simply complements the rest of it. It shows the unity of people is achieved by unity of sacrifice. And that is a big emphasis here in this passage. Everybody puts the animal to death at the same time. You get together with other people to do it. In the future, it'll all be done in one place. And so in order to display what's meant by sacrifice in the kingdom, God gives us one sacrifice, one set of sacrifices where the animal is cut up to show what that means. And then He gives us a sacrifice that's not cut up, and we have to put them together in order to get a full picture of what's involved.
Tearing out Jesus' seamless garment, they didn't tear it. Does that fit into this?
No, I don't think the seamless garment does, but I think the rending of the veil does. I think the rending of the veil is a sign. No bone of Jesus' body is broken, but the veil is ripped in half. And so you've got both images there. The whole sacrifice entire, and also the idea of ripping in half. Because of the veil of the temple represents Christ's body. And the rending of that veil it represents the rending of His body in half. It does a lot of other things too, but I think that's part of what it does. And it happens as He dies, you see.
Maybe that seamless garment, He did not break the covenant. He kept it, but He was torn around.
The seamless garments are associated with the cosmos in the Bible. Not just in the Bible. I mean, magicians wear robes that have suns and moons all over them. But Hebrews tells us that the universe is like a vesture for God. And the four soldiers casting lots for Jesus' garment at the foot of the cross, in my opinion, is an indication of the attempt to take over the world by man, as if God was not in control of it anymore. And that ties in with that idea.
The element of cheer.
Yeah, there's a lot of things there. Could be wrong about that, though. I could be wrong on that point. Just on that. Does anybody have another thought on why the Passover isn't broken up? I mean, I know some of you have studied through this before, but the best I've been able to do with it, and I think this is kind of what Kurt says too, he doesn't really deal with it much as I recall, but to say that it complements the other sacrifices. Yeah, but the emphasis here is that this animal is not cut up. You do have many different lambs, and of course after it's cooked, it's broken up to be eaten. But in every other case, an animal is cut up before it's put in the fire. Here it's very specifically not broken up before it's put in the fire. Everything has to be eaten. Anything left over would destroy the unity of the meal. And also, I think, nothing remains onto the 15th day. Nothing of the Passover sacrifice goes into the new world, the new week. The sacrifice is finished. And what's left is turned into smoke and ascends to God. It's holy. Now, when we get into the peace offering, I don't know how much detail we'll be able to get into, but you'll find that the peace offering is like the Passover, more like the Passover than anything else. The Passover is called a sacrifice, zavak, and that's the technical term that's used for the peace offering. The Passover is more like a peace offering than anything else because it's a shared meal. And in the peace offering, depending on which kind it is, you have to eat it all the same day, or you can eat it 2 days, but you can't keep it to the third day. And the reason you don't keep it to the third day is because it becomes specially holy on the third day or the second day, and the residue has to be given to God. And so the idea seems to be here that the sacrifice is finished, whatever might be left over is sent up to God. And again, I'm not sure where to go back for this, but I see this again typological of Christ's work. When He's finished, He ascends into heaven. And we go on into the new covenant. But I'm not sure if that fits or not. They have to eat it with unleavened bread. Leaven does not mean evil in the Bible, but it means growth and development. And it's the old development in Egypt that has to be cut off. Now think about that. Think about the history of their situation in Egypt and understand something about leaven and yeast. If we want to make bread, we go down to the store and we get a package of yeast. And it's a dry yeast. And if you want to make bread, then you put it in lukewarm water and then you put it into your bread. Or you can just dump it in, and if the bread is not cold or something, it'll become active and it'll rise. Well, they didn't have that kind of thing in the ancient world. They made bread by sourdough. And what that means is you keep some of the dough that's been leavened aside, and you use it as the starter for your next loaf of bread. You mix that sourdough or leavened dough with your next bunch of dough when you make a bread, and it leavens the entire lump. And you take some of that leaven off, and you keep it aside. The next time you make a loaf of bread, you mix it in, and it leavens the lump. Now, how long does this leaven last? You may be eating a piece of bread that's got leaven in it that's 800 years old, because it's just one loaf of bread after another in continuous succession, like an amoeba. You know, it goes on and on and on. It never stops. Now, when they first went down into Egypt, the Egyptians were all converted. The Egyptians gave them the best of the land. You always see in Genesis that they're rejoicing at everything that happens with the sons of Israel. They delight every time God blesses His people. Jacob goes before the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, "Tell me how it's been." Jacob says, "Well, to be honest with you, few and evil have been in the days of my sojourning. It's been really rotten. And for the first 77 years of my life, my older brother persecuted me, and he hated God, and my father favored him, and then I went over to earn my wives, and I was cheated there and reduced to slavery, and got all the lame and bad sheep and got them out, and then people tried to kill me, and as soon as I got back into the promised land, my sons murdered and massacred a bunch of people, and I had to move away from the area, and then they drove my favorite son down here into Egypt, and I've had a really rotten life." And that's how God treats His servants. And Pharaoh gets down on his knees and says, "Would you bless me?" Well, you got to be converted to hear a story like that and still want to be blessed by God who treats people that way. I would think Pharaoh would say, "Boy, I'm glad I don't worship your God. Give me some other God." But no, it says, you got the picture there. Pharaoh's on his knees in front of Jacob and wants to be blessed by Jacob. There's no way to misinterpret that. So the leaven was good, but you see what happens to Israel in Egypt, and it's obvious, is the Egyptians go into idolatry, and the Israelites follow them into idolatry. Joshua 24 tells us that, or is it 23? One of them tells us that they were worshiping false gods in Egypt, and it's obvious they are anyway, because people don't get reduced to slavery by God unless they have sinned. And so the leaven, you see, has gone bad. And this whole continuity, a year after year, the same leaven going through one loaf after another, that's all cut off. And where are you going to get your new leaven? Well, leaven is made from plants, fetch and other things that are ground up in water. If you don't have any continuous sourdough, you've got to go get some of these plants, and you've got to grind them up and put them in warm water and get the leaven started up again. Where are you going to get these new plants? You're going to get them in the Holy Land, in the Promised Land. So you're going to get new leaven in a new land and start your new week. And you have a week to cut it all off, and then you can get new leaven from somewhere else. Of course, in the wilderness, they weren't in the Holy Land yet, but they got new leaven. And God has them cut this leaven off every year. Start new. The implication is that the grace that God gives us gradually goes sour because we abuse the gifts that God gives us, and so we cut it off and start again. Again, the idea, I think, is that sin is cut off in youth and a new creation begins. And that's part of what's going on there, and I think that's why unleavened bread is what's put on the altar. It always indicates the cutting off of sin in youth and a new beginning. So leaven is this development, but you see, it can be the development of the kingdom of God. When you get into the Promised Land, after the week of unleavened bread, you get some of this new holy leaven out of the Holy Land, and you start leavening things, and when you get down to Pentecost, you've got leavened loaves, and you bring them, and they are offered to God. Although they're not put in the fire, they're offered to God at Pentecost, and that's a command. Leviticus 23, you will bring leavened loaves with you at Pentecost. So that's the leaven of the kingdom that's growing and developing. But if it goes bad, you cut it off, and God gives you new leaven, starts you up again. God who makes all things new. Then they're to eat it with bitter herbs. When we go back to Leviticus 2, we find that honey is not allowed in the sacrifices, but rather here with the unleavened bread comes bitter herbs. Now, bitter herbs are not put on the altar, but here in Passover, they're eaten. I see the bitter herbs as the opposite of honey. Bitter is the opposite of sweet. Well, actually, bitter is the opposite of salt, and sour is the opposite of sweet, but I don't think in the Bible we're using language quite that precisely as we do in English. Bitter herbs, I think, are the opposite of honey. Honey is the sign of the new kingdom. Sacrifice makes entry possible, but takes place on the last day of the old world. And until you get into the new Promised Land, you don't have honey. While in the old world, bitterness is a reminder of sin. That's how I see this. Again, you see, the altar is the doorway into the land. And right now we're in the doorway. And in the doorway we haven't come into the land yet. So we haven't moved into the land of milk and honey. We're here in the doorway, so there's no honey. We're cutting off the old leaven. We're at the altar, which is the door. We haven't gone in to the new land yet. So these are all signs of transition from the old to the new. Any comments or questions on that now?
The first question, the point was made that there have been some commentators recently who have said that unleavened bread wasn't necessarily without yeast, it was just without sourdough, that yeast and sourdough are two different things.
Well, I suppose that's possible, and it wouldn't really change the meaning because you are cutting off this continuity of sourdough. The question is, during the week of unleavened bread, is your bread actually unleavened and unyeasted, or can you already start producing something new during that week? From my reading on food and stuff in history, I have never seen that idea before, that leaven means sourdough and the yeast would be something else. I'd have to really look at what Gordon Fee says there and reflect on it. Okay.
The special treatment given to Passover.
I don't think so, because from what I can see in the New Testament rite, it's only the part that is actually eaten that has any sacramental aspect. What we don't read in the New Testament ritual is that Jesus set apart bread and wine, and then after a few minutes, after something else, then he gave it to them. What we read is that he simply took it and gave it to them, and as he gave it to them, he said, "This is my body and this is my blood," and that's different from this. So it seems to me that the leftover bread and wine from communion is just bread and wine. It's just leftovers. I don't believe in any rite of consecration or act of setting apart or epiclesis in a worship service. I think you just take hold of the bread and pray for it and distribute it. and what's left over is just leftovers. But I think you are right in that the traditional high church or Catholic, Anglo-Catholic way of dealing with leftovers is wine has got to be poured out on the ground, the bread all has to be consumed. I'm sure it does go back to this in their minds. I mean, I'm sure they're looking at this and saying, this was consecrated somehow, and in the Bible, what's consecrated has to be thoroughly consumed. You can't just take it back to make it normal again. But I don't see that as a correct analogy myself. Do you have any thoughts on that? Thanks. Just leave me twisting in the wind. Go ahead.
You mentioned the land not being broken, not being separated. In the past, I'm talking about the meeting back of Christ.
Yeah, Gregory Dix makes a big point that the fraction shouldn't be seen as an allegory of the death of Christ, in other words, in any sense. It's just for distribution purposes. And I thought that for a long time, but I have revised my thinking there because the act of separating is so important in the Bible, starting in Genesis 1. God's way of changing the world is he starts off by making the stuff and he separates it. And he separates man off from the ground, he separates the woman off from the man. And each one of these is covenant-making things. When the things are separated, they're bound together. If they're alienated, you got a problem. And then that alienation has to be healed. So it seemed to me that the fraction of the bread does take on more the idea of a dramatized prayer to God whereby we remind Him of the death of Christ. And that's why there would be emphasis on it. But I don't know that those two things are incommensurate because in the ritual of the Lord's Supper they're condensed. Yeah. See, there are two ways in which a separation takes place in sacrifice. One is all the blood is taken out of the flesh and separated. The second is that the flesh itself is cut up. In Jesus on the cross, blood was spilled out, but His body wasn't separated up. But the breaking of the bread, it does seem to me now, is part of the ritualized prayer by which we remind the Father of the death of Christ.
Could you comment on the water and blood? How do you see that?
Well, the water and the blood come out of Christ's side, and Eve was made out of Adam's side, and the church is constituted through water and blood, baptism and blood. That's the traditional understanding of that that's a picture of the birth of the church on the basis of the death of Christ, that the bride comes out of His side, and the bride is constituted, created by the water and the blood. And I'm satisfied with that. That's the ancient explanation, and it makes sense to me. There may be other things that could be said, maybe there's a problem with that. Go ahead. Jeff, in rehearsing Schaff and Nevin's view last night, said what's absolutely true, and the church is unified, whether we perceive her as unified or not. And no matter how many denominations there are, the church is unified in Christ, but what is true in essence has not yet been made manifest. The other thing that I would say in answer to that is that Jesus didn't say, understand this in memory of me. That's my memorial. He said, do this. And so what your elders do agree on is doing it, even if they don't agree on the explanation of it. And see, I think that in Protestant churches, we get so concerned about evaluating the Lutheran doctrine and the Zwinglian doctrine and the Catholic doctrine and all the different doctrines of what it means that we forget that the actual unity that we have in the church is based on the doing more than it is on the understanding. Understanding is the Scripture, but I think there are elements of the Lord's Supper that we'll never understand. So, obviously one works toward unity of understanding. Faith seeks understanding. But there is a unity there that's not only spiritual and invisible in Christ, but also is visible in the fact that there's agreement in the action, even if there's not agreement in the interpretation of the action. You shall eat it in this manner, verse 11. These things are unique, you see, to the first Passover. Eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste, it is the Lord's Passover. I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and strike down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. The gods are judged because their servants are slain. And those gods will starve. You have to feed those kinds of gods, and their servants won't be able to feed them anymore. I am Yahweh, he says. Verse 13, and the blood will be a sign to you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And this day will be a memorial to you, to remind God. You will celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You're to celebrate it as an eternal ordinance. So you remind God by doing this. Final point that I have down here I think is important, and that is, in the book of Exodus, the paragraphs are written in such a way that the key word occurs 7 or 14 times in paragraph after paragraph from Exodus 1 forward. You can just take each paragraph in the book and you will find most of the time key words occurring 7 or 14 times. It's very remarkable how the book is written in that way. And in this section, eating occurs 7 times. And it indicates that we have to eat and not just watch what's going on here. But I think there's a little bit more to this idea of eating, and that is, the human body is like the tabernacle. There are other places that are doorways, but the mouth is also a doorway. And in the action of a sacrifice, these things are presented before God, before His view, and God comes to dwell in the tabernacle when the sacrifices are displayed. Well, you ask the question, why do you eat this food then? Why do we in the New Testament, where do we put the blood? We don't take the wine and sprinkle it on the Lord's table. We drink it. And in my mind, the answer has to be that taking it inside of ourselves displays it before God and cleanses the way for God to come and be Shekinah inside of us. And the New Testament has so much to say about that. Christ dwelling in you. And it's not just that we eat His flesh and drink His blood, but also that the drinking of the blood is the way in which the blood is displayed now. We don't display it on an altar. We don't display it on doorposts or smear it on our legs. We display it by drinking it. And God who indwells us then sees it. And we remain a sanctuary for that reason. So there is an external display of this when the congregation does the rite together, but there's also this internal display that's a result of eating it, and I think that ties in with a lot of things connected with eating in the Bible. Here, even if that goes too far for you, it's clear enough, I think, that eating the sacrifice is a way of personal appropriation. And we'll see in the peace offering that that is the climax to the covenant renewal structure of the sacrificial system. Sins are forgiven, you're consecrated, but there needs to be this personal appropriation that comes through eating, and that'll be Peter's topic when we get back together. Any more discussion on this and before our break? Yes?
Is it possible in that literature of the angel doing 2 things?
Well, the angel of death is called the avenger, but see, that is also a redeemer. And so the idea of being present with as kinsman is just the flip side of being the avenger who destroys. So there's a lot of value in that idea. The angel comes to be in the house with the people at the same time. The angel goes and destroys those who are not under the blood.